you very much. What a delight, what an honour, what a privilege to be here. I'd like to invite up all of the panel members. We'll have them all come up at the same time. Then we'll do the introduction. So first of all, we've got Dr. Shane Clifton. Really lovely to have you here, Shane. A scholar in theology and ethics, an honorary associate at the University of Sydney, and doing a really critical role at the moment in the Disability Royal Commission. Aunty Andrews, who you've already met, who's a leading Indigenous thinker, an author, a barrister, and the co-director of Evolve Communities. Definitely worth checking out if you haven't already. Amazing work that you're doing there. Thank you. We've got Dr. Ian Gawler, who you have met already as well, but a real expert in meditation and the founder of the Gawler Foundation. Please come through. Michael, you're absolutely welcome to have a seat just here. I'll introduce you in a moment. We've got Dr. Katherine Trebeck, who's a political economist, a writer, an advocate for economic change, system change, and the co-founder of the Wellbeing Economy Alliance. And Dr. Michael Steger, and that's the last time I'll call you Dr. Michael. We were talking about that before as well. Psychologist, and really doing some great work in his research with regards to how a meaningful life can help us with our well-being. So thank you. It's great to have every single one of you here. I really appreciate it. I'm going to start with you, Shane, if that's okay, and to ask you, what does an ethical life mean, and how do we know if we're living one?
That's a big question, and of course the answer to the second one is we don't. Most of us, I think, are trying to live ethically, and whether we're doing that by following God or our national ideology or our intuition or our parents, we're still probably having some pretty negative effects on others, on ourselves, on the natural world. So it is a difficult thing to do, to act ethically in this day and age. I guess there's hints or ways of acting more or less ethically, and I think we can ask ourselves some questions. For example, are we looking to develop our character? Character's a habit, it's habitual, you've got to work at it. Love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, self-control, the scriptures talk about. Are we thinking about our effect on others, the consequences of our actions? It's that standard, do no harm. I like a higher standard, actually, maybe have a positive impact on others. And are we recognising that actually we are imperfect? There's a certain humility needed, I think, to live the ethical life. So listen to other voices, be prepared to change your thinking. Sometimes follow the temptations the actions that you think you shouldn't do, because sometimes your conscience leads you astray. And maybe the last thing is weigh your sources, because although you need to listen to other voices, we know in this day and age there's plenty of voices maybe you shouldn't be listening to. And I don't think there's enough thought in the modern world about judging the quality of the voices that you're listening to. So that's just a few hints. No doubt there's many more things we could say. Let me just add, be gracious and kind to yourself when you fail.
Yes.
I'm
so glad that you've added that in, like being gracious and kind to yourself when you fail. I think that's so important. And I like that bit about listening to the wise voices. So Aunty Munya, what can Aboriginal wisdom teach us about living an ethical life?
Yeah, well, it's all about protocols and following set rules already. So I find that very useful, because then you don't have to think about it so much. It's in the law, you know. And I talked about this morning, you know, Dreamtime being an ethics code for us, because it teaches us about how to treat other people and be respectful, but be respectful to our fellow creatures as well, that we have responsibilities to them as well. And kinship in particular, people that do our courses that we offer and that we teach Aboriginal kinship, and about how everybody is interrelated and interconnected with one another, but there are firm set rules of how to behave to certain relatives, including your mother-in-law, because in our culture, In our culture, you're not allowed to speak to your mother-in-law, for instance, and she's not allowed to speak to you either. So when you do speak to each other, you speak through a third party, or there's also, in some nations, have a mother-in-law language on its own. And so there's rules about how you behave towards her. So it's an inbuilt conflict resolution model that already exists. You don't have problems with your mother-in-law because you're not supposed to interact with one another. And the way that we show respect to our mother-in-laws in my culture is we give her our backs. That's how you show respect to her. But the wonderful thing about it, it's all there. You don't question it. That's just the way it is. And the rules help you. So you're not so much left to being human and trying to figure these things out. They're already thought of. And when you ask the old people, oh, where does this kinship system come from? They go, from Dreamtime. It goes way, way back then. And so I find that very useful. It's almost like a blueprint for behaviour and action.
Yeah, great, really having that structure. That's so interesting about mother-in-laws, isn't it? Thank you. And it's making me think as well about just the complexity of this living an ethical life. And even, I'm wondering from your perspective, like you've spent a lot of time helping people cope with serious illness by really using the power of the mind. So looking at this now from the perspective of temptation, can we train our mind to resist temptation and navigate challenges and make friends with uncertainty? Can we train our mind, or are there just some people who are naturally good at that and other people not so much?
Yeah, I guess we're talking about does it matter what choices we make? And if it does, how do we make good choices? And so when we're faced with any sort of situation that does require a choice, we've got different things we can draw upon. It sort of comes back to what I was talking about in the talk earlier with this active mind and the still mind. So the active mind's the domain of the intellect and knowledge, and we can see a real difference between like raw information and what comes out of the still mind, which is the wisdom that understands how that raw information, that science, can be best applied. And I imagine all of us would have our own sense of situations where science has lacked wisdom and based on what seemed like good evidence made some really dumb choices. And so I think from a personal point of view, it's good just to understand this actually, that if we're making decisions from the perspective of our active mind, then it's always going to be a debate. There's always going to be pluses and minuses. Science likes to think it's very precise, and in mathematics it can be, but most other things you end up with a debate. And medicine's a great example. Nearly everything in medicine, you'll have people with different views about what's the best thing to do. And so if you're trying to resolve that and you stay with the perspective of your active mind, you've got a chance of making a good decision, but there's always going to be an element of doubt and uncertainty, I'd suggest. Whereas if you can come at it from your still mind, that's this place where there's just actually really pristine clarity. And you can actually get through the still mind to the choice of no choice, where things are just so clear that it's like you don't have an option. And that's not a problem. It's not like you feel like you're restricted or restrained. It's actually joyful because it's like, well, it's so clear what to do in this situation. I can commit to it fully. And when people have that sort of level of clarity and confidence, then they're likely to actually follow through and not only have good ideas but carry them through. So I think it's really important that we understand with decision making that we do use the active mind in a day-to-day sense, but if it's informed by our still mind, then we're likely to actually do a lot better.
And I was going to ask about that actually on the day-to-day side of things, like in the moment, when we need to make a decision right now about something, do you think we can access the still mind in that moment when
I think it's
we're under pressure?
Yeah, you can. It's an accumulative sort of thing. If I speak personally, if I have to write something that's significant, I'll go through a process where intellectually I'll look at all the information and, if it's got research or whatever, you look into all your sources. But then I'll always go off and I'll just sit and contemplate and reflect. And that's a process internally of going over that information, but then actually just dropping it and going into that stillness. And if something comes out of that, which it invariably does, then it's much more likely to be useful than what I might have first thought with just my ordinary thinking mind.
So it is trainable. It is
Very
trainable.
Yeah. Dalai Lama said there's two great things about the mind. The first is that it can change. That's pretty good, because if you woke up grumpy and you couldn't change, it would be pretty unpleasant. And the second thing is you can train it. So, and you train both the active mind and you train to actually become more familiar and more connected with the still mind.
Yes, great. So something that we can actually access in that moment then. Well, I love that we can go from looking at the individual and what we can do in that moment. Now I might go bigger picture, Katherine, if that's okay, because you co-founded the Wellbeing Economy Alliance, and that was to help support policymakers to build a more just and sustainable world economy for people and the planet. So what do economics have to do with leading our best life and resisting temptation?
I'm just actually stuck on this idea that Aunty and Lucy should go into business, because you can sort the husbands and sort the mother-in-laws at the same time. So that's I'm going to do all I can to help that that business happen. But I think the way the economy is structured at the moment, it operates in a way that profoundly hinders so many people being able to live their best lives, because of the extent of poverty and inequality. And that's not a matter of scarcity. We live in a very, very rich world full of plenty. And it's political decisions that shape distribution of those resources and who it is who's getting way more than their fair share, and then leaving so many people struggling to get by, coping with the fallout of environmental breakdown that's driven by those at the very top and the production and consumption systems that they create. And so the way the economy operates is an absolute limit on so many people being able to live their best lives. And it also does drive this idea of temptation. And I'm a big fan of the late economist Manfred Max Neef, and he talks about this idea of these fundamental human needs that we all have, no matter where we are in the world. We satisfy them in very, very different ways, depending on where we are and different priorities. But we all have these innate human needs for purpose, for dignity, for time in nature, as you heard, from time with friends. And what's happened is that economic actors are really, really good at tapping into that and channeling into that. And I know I've showed you an ad earlier on, but another ad is for Ray-Bans, and it's all about have this sense of belong to your family, belong to your community, belong to these people. And so it really taps into that fundamental need for belonging. And guess what their solution is? Buy some Ray-Bans. On a bus going past me in Glasgow just a couple of years ago, I saw this ad and it said, want to feel a sense of community? Join the British Army. And so these economic actors, of which, believe me, the Army is, are absolutely so good at tapping into our fundamental needs for status, for belonging, for being part of a community, but exploiting them to drive this extractive production and consumption system. And so I think the best thing that we can do is sort of tap these ideas of compassion and care for each other and bring them to our economic decisions, to what we decide to buy, what we do with our stuff, how we invest, what sort of businesses we support. And there's that lovely line which has been attributed and I think misattributed to Gandhi of live simply so that others might simply live. And we live in a country that takes up more than its ecological fair share. So we are implicitly saying that others around the world who do not have enough, who do not have the space to increase their basic material needs, are not going to get a chance to do that because we're taking more than our fair share of the world's resources. And so if we're going to apply that idea of compassion, we need to think in every single economic choice we make of our care for others and how that translates to those choices we make.
And for yourself personally, like I've really enjoyed hearing you talk on podcasts and on your TED Talk and hearing some examples of how you live this in your personal life. Is there anything that you would want to share? Like I know you've talked about buying secondhand clothing and things like that.
Secondhand. It's hard.
Yeah.
And it's really hard. And I think the older I get, the better I get at just cutting myself a bit of slack, that we still live in this paradigm. And so we can't be perfect. And so we have to try to make choices where we can, but understand that we're living in societies and physical infrastructure and institutional infrastructures that are acting against us, trying to make those choices. So do the best you can. Talk about it to have so people have permission to do this. So to give you a quick story. In the UK, I love going to charity shops. I'm furnishing my house in Canberra at the moment from this awesome place called Green Shed. If anyone's from Canberra, you'll know it. It's brilliant. It's basically the tip, where they, chairs and tables and things. It's brilliant. But there's a real stigma in the UK for some people about shopping at charity shops, and I love tearing people like these trousers got from the Oxfam shop, but that's because I'm feeling okay with my status. And if, in a consumer society where we judge each other by our wealth and status, if you're having to shop at charity shops because of economic need, that can be really, really painful and come with a whole sense of shame. So I think one of the things, those of us who have that financial autonomy, that real privilege, is to really celebrate this, doing this because it's about the circular economy, and really make it okay and try to push back against that judgment that's associated with material acquisition and financial status.
There's so much into it. Do you have a sense of hope?
It's really hard to have hope at the moment, where we see, Pakistan has just been pretty much underwater. We see fires across Europe. We see Melbourne has just appointed chief heat officers to deal with rising temperatures. And where our politicians are talking in terms of what they're offering is so far from what's needed. I feel hope when I see the incredible organisations, individuals, community groups, particularly young people, rolling up their sleeves and starting to create initiatives themselves. Will it be enough in time? I don't know. Well, I'm hopeful because of this conference, though. Yes.
Yeah. And thank you for all of the work that you do in this space as well. It's really incredible. And the work that you do, Mike, as well. You've developed meaning in life questionnaires and inventories to help with purpose, and again, another brilliant TED Talk. So how can they help us in navigating tricky situations? We'd love to hear you riff on that.
Yeah, me too. I'd like to see what I think now after hearing, after absorbing the wisdom on the panel today. And I think the idea I've been struck with is that this orbiting set of systems, like rules, are incredibly important, right? In some cases. And individual consent to rules, individual understanding of how to behave ethically, also important. So in a culture that has created rules, like Aunty you described, that have wonderful functions, are from within the culture, that is an amazing way to make ethical choices much easier. A lot of the world lives in a system where the rules are made by other people. A lot of times we don't even know who they are, and it's destructive to us. And so the role then shifts to the individual to somehow, turn from that quivering koala from your heartbreaking cartoon, clinging to a tree with depression or whatever it was, into a ferocious warrior that's going to take down the faceless people who run the global economic system. And it's overwhelming to think about, right? But that is our job and meaning. The world is our lives are a blank slate when we're born in a lot of ways. We can consult scripture and national messages and deep heritage, but ultimately we do make our choices within that, whether we choose to abdicate responsibility for seeing the consequences of our actions or not. A meaningful life calls us to own what we do. And that's when we get this tension, right? We need to figure out, are the rules okay? Right? And at least for me, when we think about ethics, maybe we think about Aristotle, maybe we think about Christian scripture, or Islamic rules, or Talmudic writings, or we think about these Western European, Mediterranean-based systems, because that's what our contemporary world, the snapshot of a cultural accident we live in right now, one view says how the whole world is going to function and propagates these rules onto everyone else. And when the rules are good, such a blessing to be able to follow them wisely, consistently, and endorse them as our own. But that's the struggle we're seeing now, is that we don't get to always choose the rules. We're not always having to follow the best rules. So then we need to consult those wise voices, and we need to find communities that can develop solutions. Most of the people who have ever existed, most of the cultures that have ever existed, most of the people who exist right now have no voice in what it means to run society in the contemporary world. It's just a small sliver of people from a tiny cultural accident of highly individualistic, post-monarchical cultures who run the world. Is that what we want? So we have to think that through. That's what meaning says. You don't shy away from questions, right? Mm-hmm. So the Meaning Life Questionnaire, one of the scales is your life meaningful? I hope so. Another scale is, are you searching for meaning? And what you see is particularly in Western countries that are highly individualistic, and especially among older people, if they're searching for meaning, to them that means they failed somehow. You shouldn't have questions about your life anymore if you're wise. But if you look at folks in Japan, in South Korea, in parts of, though not all of China, searching for meaning is meaning. It is always questioning. It is always asking those important questions of what are we supposed to do next? And it's best if we can find some good, wise rules to conform to that ensure other people's dignity. The rules that we're being asked to conform to now churn us through damage to other people who don't get a voice. So that's really the starting place now, and I hope that we can come together. That the hope is that the small microcosms of people we see here today can become the next macrocosm, I think. That's where the hope is. The macro view isn't always so encouraging. But everyone in this room would run things differently, I suspect. So we just need to keep listening to each other and creating a new collective. So the choices we make reflect what's best for all of us.
The choices we make, so important. And I think that leads us to probably our last question here that I could put to anyone who would like to answer it. And I guess it is coming back to that point about the choices that we make. So for any of you, if you were faced with a major ethical dilemma, what would be the tool or the process or the question that you would ask that would help you to decide what action that you would take? And I might, Aunty Munda, please.
For me, it's a spiritual solution, and the way I've always lived my life is to seek advice from the ancestors. We call them the old people. So whenever I have to make a decision about something or whether it's right or wrong, I go out into the bush and I talk to the old people and I say, look, I'm faced with this. Can you help me with it? Can you guide me? And I always find that invariably they always do, that I receive advice, and it may be come through dreams, it may be that I have a conversation with someone else and they say something, so it's like an answer to a prayer. I suppose some people, go off and pray about it, so I go and talk to the old people.
Yeah, talking. Thank you. And when I chatted with you about this, Shane, you mentioned talking as well. Do you want to give your... And because I'm so small, while you're answering, I'm going to stand up and see what the countdown clock says.
Can't see it either.
Right, okay, thanks. So yours will be the last answer.
Yeah. Look, I guess I feel let down by my religious elders, so I've escaped my religious answers in many ways for the reasons spoken about here. And it's become very simple. I have deep relationships with my brothers and my children and a few people I trust. And so for all my hard decisions, I have deep conversations. And it's as simple as that.
That connection, the compassion, the conversations, this engagement in the way that's occurring here is so important. So I really want to deeply thank you all very much for being here. So Shane, Ian, Katherine, Aunty, Munya and Michael, it's been a real privilege and a pleasure to be on the stage with you. So thank you. A big round of applause for our panel. Thank you.